Okay, hello, everyone. So welcome to the session in political economy of the ASA meetings. So just as a reminder of the format of this session, so we will have 15-minute presentations followed by 10-minute discussions of the three papers, and then there will be time for general discussion with the participants and the attendees. Okay, so just a quick reminder to keep yourself muted while others are presenting, and yeah, anything you can write, and I'll keep an eye on the chat. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Jonathan Chapman, who is going to present a paper about financing sanitation infrastructure in 19th century England and Wales. So Jonathan, the floor is yours.
So I can work out how to unmute to share my slides. So thank you very much. So first thing to say, well, thank you everyone for coming. So as you can see, the title of the paper is slightly different. It's now Interest Rate, Sanitation, Infrastructure, and Mortality Decline. It's the same paper. The reason it's changed, I want to let you know, is the paper has now actually been accepted at the Journal of Economic History, which is great news. Part of that involved changing the title, and also adding the bit on mortality decline, which is the paper expanded through the refereeing process. So the idea of this paper is slightly different maybe to some of the previous work that I've done, in that I'm still looking at mortality decline. And we know that actually 19th century urbanization was accompanied by very high mortality in cities around the world. Life expectancy in Manchester and Liverpool was under 40 in the 1850s. And there's been a lot of literature, including some of my own work, looking at how and showing that investments in urban infrastructure are really a key part of the solution to these problems. So things like building clean water supply systems, building sewer systems, really ameliorated some of the downsides of this city growth. So there's been a lot of literature on that. What I want to look at today is a bit different, which is thinking about how successful Britain actually was in providing these critical public goods in the second half of the 19th century. And so there's been some previous work on that. I think most of the work previously looking at like why maybe some places didn't invest in sanitation is focused on the fact that people didn't want to pay for them. There's local political movements. This paper is trying to look at something slightly different, which I think has been underemphasized in a lot of the literature, which is that actually these things are just really expensive to produce. And so like variation in input costs could be an issue. Particularly what I'm looking at here is the cost of borrowing. It was actually very expensive to borrow to fund this investment, and that actually held some places back. So this slide is just meant to show you that actually in the beginning of, so even by the 1850s, people in England and Wales understood that sanitation was important. This isn't just something we've uncovered recently as economic historians. So this is the father of the sanitary movement, Edwin Chadwick. This is so politically this was understood. This was understood in the popular press. This is a cartoon from Punch. This is a very filthy court being called a court for King Cholera. And this is a picture from John Snow's famous work in the 1850s showing that cholera is a waterborne disease. And all of these things are understood in 1850. And following that, there's a series of public health acts in England. The last sort of landmark public health act, I guess, was 1875 in this context, which is the start of this graph here. And so what this graph is showing you is that, well, after 1875, there was quite a lot of investment in sanitation infrastructure in England and Wales. So the y-axis here is the total amount of borrowing. This was used for sanitation investment. This will be one of my main variables, measuring investment. And you can see borrowing is consistently quite high. This is the tax base divided by 10, this gray line. So it's around 10% of the tax base in towns every year is being invested. That's quite a lot. At the same time, though, you can see actually there's a huge spike in the 1890s. Really, it takes off in the 1890s, which is 20 years after the Public Health Act. And so this spike was what really started on this project, because this really isn't that well discussed or that widely discussed in the British economic history literature, but it's really striking. And it's striking, I think, that it's so far after the 1870s. And then when I looked a little bit more, you see that, well, actually, there's this really clear correlation between this borrowing and this fall in the interest rate. So this red line is the consul rate, the government's cost of borrowing. And you can see some very sort of striking correlation, suggestive evidence here that, well, what's really driving a lot of this increase in spending is just the fact that the cost of borrowing was dropping dramatically in the 1890s. And you can see that this is associated with an increase in the value of borrowing when people borrow, that's the dark blue line, and just the percentage of towns borrowing. So by 1900, around 60% of towns actually borrow to invest in sanitation. So when I asked, could Britain have done better, I'm thinking of the fact that, well, maybe we could just have accelerated this whole process and not waited till the 1890s. So in 1903, still less than 60% of towns had loans outstanding relating to water supply, less than 80% had loans relating to sewage. So there's still a lot of places this isn't rolled out to. And there's a lot of variation across different areas in improvements in infant mortality. And so this is despite all this sort of 60 or 70-year-old public health campaign at this point, and the fact that, as I've shown in earlier work, public health expenditure was effective. And so to understand this, we really need to understand the fact that towns at this time, they controlled their own investments and they had to fund everything locally, which meant that investment required borrowing, because these are expensive things, on security of local taxes. They couldn't receive grants from the central government. There was a central authority which was overseeing their borrowing powers, which put some limitations on their ability to borrow. And one thing I'll be talking more about is that they did have some access to what are supposedly, and I will go into why I'm putting quotation marks around this, subsidized loans through the Public Works Loan Board. But when I'm thinking about could Britain have done better, I'm thinking, well, what actually could the central government have done in a sense that was feasible at the time, not just kind of in a perfect system? And one answer I'll be coming back to is, well, maybe they could have subsidized these loans a bit better or a bit more strongly. So what the paper does is I use a data set which is based on financial accounts from these towns, all the towns essentially in England and Wales, around 800 towns between 1875 and 1903. It's looking at the importance of cheap money in stimulating investment. Talked about some of these other questions. And I'd say there's 4 components to the paper, and I don't have time to talk about them all today, but one of them is a more descriptive element where I'm talking about who towns are borrowing from, how much. Then I have some fixed effects regressions, which really demonstrate this strong negative relationship between interest rates and infrastructure investment. The third part is I have some instrumental variable regressions, which is what I will be talking about today, which is showing, hopefully causally, this fall in interest rates on investment, and also some similar regressions looking at mortality. So point 3 and maybe point 4 I'll talk about now. And what I do in the paper is I use the stock of loans outstanding as a proxy for the stock of investment in infrastructure. So this has a long-running history all the way back to the 19th century as a way of measuring urban progress. After 1883, I can distinguish loans for sanitation purposes, specifically clean water supply, sewers, and streets, from general loans. Expenditure is separated between expenditure out of loans and not out of loans. So expenditure out of loans is essentially investment expenditure, and that will be my main dependent variable. So I estimate interest rates in the following way. So one of the nice things about this data set is I can calculate town-specific interest rates. And I do that by calculating the level of expenditure on interest during the year divided by the average amount of loans outstanding during the year. So this has got, you might worry about this for a few different reasons. There's measurement error here, potentially. I think you might be concerned about some selection bias where actually, well, if you have very high potential interest rates, you won't borrow and I won't observe this at all. So there are some concerns here, and this is one of the reasons I think that we'll see that there's a lot of noise in the interest rate variable, and some cause of that is this, the fact I have to estimate these interest rates and not observe them directly. I have this data between 1887 and 1903, so the regressions will be focused on that shorter period and not the longer period I showed you in the graph earlier, and that's because of this limitation. So to fund these investments, as I said, towns had to borrow. They could borrow from both private and public sources. They had to require sanction of either the local government board or a local act to be able to borrow. So they had some constraint. They couldn't just go out and borrow whenever they wanted. Importantly, all the councils did have the ability to borrow. So they couldn't borrow from the private market. They had the right to go to what was called the Public Works Loan Board to ask for loans. The purpose of this varied over time. Ian Webster has looked at this in quite a lot of detail. After 1840s, sanitation becomes quite an important part of their portfolio in terms of what they're doing. But interestingly, what we'll see is over the 1880s and 1890s, it actually becomes less important. And there's this ongoing debate within the government between those advocating more generous terms to support sanitation investment and the fact the Treasury is getting really concerned that people are actually borrowing a lot. So on one side, you have public health campaigners who are like, we really want to subsidize borrowing. so that people invest in these really important, infrastructure. And exactly at the time that their policies were working, the Treasury got very concerned exactly that they were working, and there was a huge amount of borrowing going on. On the other hand, you had private capital markets. This was a mix of insurance companies, some private individuals, and some banks. And what's really important to the variation I'm about to show you is that there's a lot of variation who could actually access these private markets. So which towns could. In particular, there's a quote here from a historian who's saying the big towns and cities experienced little difficulty in raising finance for their ambitious projects. They had a comparative advantage in access to loans, which after 1870 they extensively exploited. And we'll see this in a second very directly, using the data that I collected. So over here, this panel on the left, these blue waves, this is the variation in the interest rate in my data set. This is what I measured here. You can see there really is a lot of variation. And at the same time, this red line somehow disappeared from down here is the console rate. So this is the government's cost of borrowing. So you can see, as you might expect, there's consistently a wedge between what the government is borrowing and what the towns are able to borrow at. But you can also see there's a lot of variation, a lot of heterogeneity across different towns. So exactly where that comes from is something we'll discuss more in a second. And of course, this is a key, sort of where this comes from is going to be key to the causal identification. What's interesting over here on the right-hand side is for some towns, I actually can collect information on what they're borrowing, what their interest rates were in the 1870s. And then I can look at, this is from parliamentary papers, this is the same data sources on the left, and I can actually compare over time what is happening to interest rates in towns of different sizes. And see, there's a very clear hierarchy where the smaller towns are paying higher interest rates. Even in 1887, what's interesting is by 1903, at the end of the period, this is really converged and they're very close together again. So what I do is I use this quick drop in interest rates in the 1870s or 1870s and 1880s and 1890s to test the effect of these falling interest rates on investment in sanitation. So the main specifications I'm going to show you here is this investment per capita in sanitation between 1887 and 1903. And then the main independent variable is the change in interest rate between 1887 and 1903. Then I control for the existing loan stock, the tax base in different towns, and socio-demographic control variables. So this is fine, but you might worry, well, what's driving this drop in interest rates? The fact that towns can get cheap interest rates is clearly somewhat endogenous. So I have sort of, because you would worry a lot about the identification here, I run instrumental variables analysis. And this analysis I think is interesting, both for causal identification purposes, but also exactly what it's showing. And what I use to instrument the fall in the interest rate are two measures which actually use the extent of borrowing from the Public Works Loan Board before 1886. So this is the government borrowing authority. And so what I'm arguing is actually if you borrowed from the Public Works Loan Board early, before this drop in interest rates, so this is unforeseeable, this is an exogenous shock, you were then restricted from accessing these cheap loans later on. So I use these two measures, the percentage of your loans which are from the PWLB, and this binary indicator for whether you had any loan from the PWLB between 1882 and 1886. And what's the logic for this? Well, the logic is twofold. First, I found some evidence reading the old parliamentary or the select committee notes, looking at public borrowing, said actually in borrowing from the Public Works Loan Commissioners, local authorities, the towns, are in danger because the Public Works authorities claim priority for their loans. So you actually have private borrowers who said they didn't want to lend to these towns because they were worried that they would be at the back of the queue in the event of a default. The second reason that these loans are sort of problematic is that at some point the Treasury got really worried that when you got these cheap private loans, everyone started just paying back their government loans. And they got so worried they actually made it costly to repay the loans to the government. So this became like sitting on the books. They couldn't refinance these loans because the Treasury didn't let towns refinance them. So for both of those reasons, actually borrowing early from the government inhibited the town's ability to borrow later at very low interest rates from private lenders. So these are the first stage results. So here I have the change in interest rate as my dependent variable between 1887 and 1903. And you can see here the two instrumental variables, the percentage of loans in the PWLB and this binary variable, both are positively correlated. So towns which had borrowed early from the government actually experienced lower reductions in the interest rate after 1887. This is also true if we look at 1887 to 1897. So if you're worried something about my dependent variable is over a longer period, I just look at this period right up to the bottom of this drop in interest rates, and you can see similar positive correlation. So the second stage results and the OLS results, what we're really interested in here is my investment spending per capita as my dependent variable, and then the change in the interest rates. And you can see, as you expected, quite intuitively, this change in the interest rate is negatively correlated with investment spending. So towns which had a lower reduction in the interest rate invested less during this period. So towns which were able to get very big drops in interest rates were able to invest a lot. You can see that there's very big differences between the OLS and the IV coefficients here. And I think the reason for that is twofold. I think partly this is, there must be some reverse causality here, whereby places which wanted to borrow a lot would have had to pay higher interest rates to do so. And I also think probably there's some measurement, it might be due to the measurement error in the interest rate variable I mentioned before. If we accept the IV coefficients, they imply that the median fall in interest rates explained around 40% of the median investment between 1887 and 1903. I do a number of robustness tests, as you can imagine. I think I'm out of time. So just quickly in terms of the significance, the IV estimates suggest that falling interest rates after 1987 explain around 13% of investment during this period. But I think what's interesting is if we think at 16% of the 1903 loan stock in towns under and 22% in towns under 10,000. So the way I'd interpret this is what could have happened is if the government had made it easier for these towns to borrow, subsidized them in a way that was even suggested at the time by contemporaries, you could really have sped up the rollout of the sanitation infrastructure to these smaller towns, as well as maybe increasing investment at the margin in the larger towns. I don't have time to show you the results, but I also then carry out very similar regressions where my dependent variable is actually the change in infant mortality. And what this is showing you is actually, well, the investment spending that was this investment spending that occurred actually led to lower infant mortality. And this is consistent with the previous literature. And it's really just showing you that, well, this interest rate actually mattered. People weren't just building like a fancy fountain because they could. This is actually something that mattered to public health. So to conclude, so what this is showing is financial constraints slowed the expansion of local investment in the sanitation infrastructure. Falling interest rates in the 1890s really boosted investment in sanitation infrastructure at the time. And what this suggests is even with a very decentralized system, and even without engaging in grants, government probably had the ability to shape infrastructure investment. So they could have subsidized borrowing more earlier, or they could even just have removed priority from the loans in the event of a default. There weren't even any defaults. This is a purely legal on the book measure they could have taken, which would have facilitated access to private capital markets. And then there's of course more complicated things. But I think even within the scope of policies that were suggested at the time, Britain's government could have done better and actually expedited the improvements in public health. So thank you very much. Looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. This was very much on time. So maybe we can move to the discussion by Leah Brooks.
Thanks for having me. And thank you very much, Jonathan, for an interesting paper and also for being frank that the paper was already published. So I have decided I tried to think, like, given that the paper is about to be published, what would be most useful? And so my comments are just reflection on what's in your paper, what are the big themes in your paper, and what could they mean for research going forward? I very much appreciate you're not like the person who I once discussed a paper and the person had an IB result in the presentation that was not in the paper, an entirely new estimation strategy. So I appreciate that. Okay, so I think the fundamental question in your paper is whether high borrowing costs deter infrastructure investment. And we learn in your paper that jurisdictions with lower borrowing costs borrowed more for sanitation improvements, and that sanitation improvements reduce mortality, maybe lowering infant mortality by a stunning 20% if you take the outer range of the estimates. I think the even bigger question, which your paper hints but doesn't answer, is would it have been welfare improving for jurisdictions to have invested more? And I take it from the tone of your paper that I think your answer is yes, though you don't actually say that. And I think that's because the difficult part of saying yes is that we have to know what the opportunity cost of those funds were. And that is a really extremely difficult question. Anyhow, I really enjoyed the paper. Here are my thoughts. sort of looking forward from the paper. Here are the three big themes I think that are worthy of more attention that are in this paper. So first, the role of the central government in funding subnational governments. Second, authorities. And three, publicization. So a big question, I think, certainly in the local public finance literature, is how much the central government should subsidize subnational governments. And in this particular case, we're interested in whether the central government should subsidize sanitary investments for subnational governments. There's a lot of different ways you could fund sanitary investments. It's not obvious that the central government should be the one to subsidize this, but I think this is a specific case of a sort of eternal question about the relationship between a central government and its subnational governments. And there are arguments in favor of central government funding, that investment allows for welfare improving goods or infrastructure, that because there's some market failure in the capital market that the local government can't do, or that there are economies of scale for larger investments that the central government can take advantage of. But there are arguments against too. Maybe, I think there are those who would argue that there is no market failure in obtaining credit, or that subsidizing, the central government subsidizing induces spending beyond the local government's valuation. This, I think, is extremely prevalent in the European context and somewhat prevalent in the US context. A targeted subsidy may also privilege one category of expenditure above another. I think you probably have a pretty strong case that in your particular period, sanitation spending may have been the most welfare improving spending you could have done, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case for subnational government investments. And in the long run, the central government subsidy of subnational governments may increase future subnational reliance on the central government in a way that may not be welfare improving for everyone. So I think, the big economic question is, under what conditions do arguments in favor of subsidy outweigh those against? That's an eternal question for research. Second, I've been trying to convince someone to write a paper of this for ages. What do you want in authority? So this didn't actually come up in your presentation, but in the paper, we saw them hinted all over the place. There are these authorities. So authorities are these government jurisdictions, but they're not really a jurisdiction. They usually don't have elected representatives. They usually have appointed officials, and usually they direct investments for specific goods. Like in your paper, I saw turnpikes for sanitary investments. In the modern case, we see authorities for airports, sometimes for bridges, sometimes for water and sewer, but not always. Sometimes they're operated not by authorities, but by private companies. And they're government, but by their nature of being an authority, they frequently avoid politics and scrutiny, which I think must be great if you run one of them. So why do we want them, and how do they do? I think that we as economists have almost zero understanding of the role of authorities and their relationship to this whole governmental structure that we talked about in the previous comment. So why do they exist? Do they ever outlive their usefulness? What if they outlive their usefulness, but they hang on? What do their in-between nature of not quite government mean for how they provide public goods? And I don't think we even understand how prevalent they are. Even that alone would be a contribution. So that was my second thought. And then my third thought of the big picture things from your paper is this more general idea about publicization, which is a word I have made up for this slide, I think. Economists study and tout privatization. There are a gazillion papers about privatization. I think we have a lot less to say about publicization, except that maybe some vague feeling that it's a bad idea. But there's a lot of publicization that's not, Venezuela style, let's call it. There are public transit systems that used to be private that became public. The turnpikes, I learned from your paper, are basically publicized. And in countries, healthcare to varying degrees, a lot of things that, could plausibly be run by the private market, but in many developed countries are taken over by the government. Or, if run by the private market, would be run at a much smaller scale. So, I think the big political economy questions here, when do we have publicization, in which countries, and when does it ever reverse, and how do we assess value, which is really difficult when the entire sector is public. So thanks. I enjoyed the paper.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this presentation and this very interesting discussion. So according to the format, we should move to the next presentation and have the questions at the end. So keep your questions in mind. Jean, I will give you the floor for your paper, the origins of elite persistence, evidence from political purges in post-World War II France.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my slides? Yeah, okay, great. So thank you for taking some time out of your Sunday to listen about French history. And I'm pretty glad to present you this paper entitled The Origins of Elite Persistence, co-authored with talk 8 and Sergio Meon. So basically the starting fact of our study is just to observe that even over several types of regime and over political transitions, we tend to observe some elites persisting. So some elites tend to persist within political regime. That's what we know as the dynastic transmission or incumbency advantage, but they also persist over political transitions. And from previous research by Martinez Prado and co-authors, we know that this persistence of some elites after democratic transitions, for example, is quite bad for growth, institutions, and electoral competition. But from there, we actually do not understand a lot about how some elites may stay in politics after political transitions and how some elites involved in former autocratic regimes are actually still there after political transitions. And so when you turn to Ashimoga and Robinson, they explain this elite persistence as an investment in de facto power. But the form of this investment still remains to be understood or identified. So it could be wealth and weapons, the suppression of electoral competition, or better political skills. But so far, we do not really have a theory of what we call in the paper democratic purges, so purge after a democratic transition or during the democratic transition, that will decide which politicians will be allowed to stay in politics after the transition and which ones are not. And so we have a case in France, but also in other countries such as Poland, Chile, or South Africa. And maybe more about today's presentation, we also lack empirical evidence to answer two related questions. So are some elites more likely to persist or to survive political transitions? And so we don't really know, or we don't really have a causal estimate of this higher likelihood of some elites to persist. And what is the mechanism? So what is the form of this de facto, of this investment in de facto power, sorry? And how can some elites actually persist after a transition? And so to answer these questions, we turn to post-World War II France, basically because I have some knowledge of France due to my accent, but also because it's a great setting. So if you're looking at the leaflet on the left of your screen, basically in 1945, so the new regime in France had somehow to decide what to do with politicians that have been involved with the Vichy regime. So basically this leaflet is just saying, hail to the resistance and traitors of Vichy should all die. And so to answer the question of how to deal with this previous regime, the purging system in post-World War II France has three useful features. So we have the specific elite group that is targeted by what we call democratic purge. Each defendant facing this purge faced two levels of courts. So we have access to the archives of one of them. And so we can look a bit into what happened there. And then you have a well-defined elite group that included both compromised with the Vichy regime elite and some non-compromised elite with potential connections to one of the courts, and that's law graduates. And I will tell you a bit more about that setting later. So maybe we have a fully fledged model in the paper, but for the sake of time, it's a one slide summary of that. So just to get you in the spirit of how we thought of these decisions to purge. So we turn to the literature on judicial decisions. And when you think of, okay, so each individual will have a probability of being purged or acquitted. So it will depend on his own characteristics. So basically statistical discrimination. So it will be depending on I, so the defendants. Court characteristics, so some courts might be more lenient than others. And then a third component will depend on a defendant court interaction. And we label this component as the advantage of a group in front of a court. So this advantage will not depend on individual characteristics or only on court characteristics, but will appear as the two meet. And we microfound this third component with a cheat talk game. So basically in that game, defendants and their supporters may send evidence to the court to plead for their case. And we have two different kinds of connections that will lower the price to send the cost, sorry, to send this evidence. So direct connections will lower the cost for defendant to send information, and the indirect connections are somehow a way to measure the alignment in utilities between supporters of a case and the court deciding on that case. Just keep that in mind. It's not very clear now, but in the empirical setting, that's exactly what we try to capture. So a bit more of history, because it's an EHA session. So basically in France, the Vichy regime started right after the French defeat and lasted till the end of 1944. Transitional power takes place in August 1944, and right before the first elections, the first post-war elections, the jury d'honneur was created, and the jury d'honneur is the court in charge of the purging process of all politicians involved with the Vichy regime. So what is super great with these purges is that they're highly documented because it's French administration, and yeah, it's highly documented. So in April 1945, France set up this court, and by purging, we just mean declaring a politician ineligible. Defendants were all MPs having voted full powers to Marshal Pétain in 1940, or members of Vichy institutions. So if you track biographies, you really know who are the defendants. The clearance rule is also quite simple. Basically, if a defendant shows active participation in the resistance before 1943, then it could be cleared. But the procedure was quite peculiar, let's say. Each defendant faced two levels of court. First, court at the regional level emits a first decision on each defendant, stating that given the proof the court has, the court is in favor of acquitting or purging the defendant. And then in national court, the jury d'honneur gathers extra proofs and rule by unanimity. And by extra proofs, we mean administrative reports and the letters of support. That's the documents sent by the supporters I told you about before. Basically, it's, for example, I'm facing a jury, and some of you will directly write to the jury to plead in favor of me. And so we went to the archives of this process to better understand it. And basically, when you look at the archives, the process shows a lot of evidence of connections of place. So the first level of evidence is just defendants themselves complaining about the importance of connections. And I mean, it's quite straightforward. They want to be acquitted, so they will say the process is not fair. So some defendants directly wrote to the jury saying, okay, you're partial, so you should not rule my case. But one defendant even sent a letter to General de Gaulle stating that the process is not about justice, but about connections. So it's quite first level of evidence. But we also have evidence of proof of connections actually taking place in the dossier. So when you go through the files of defendants, so some defendants send letters directly to the president of the jury saying, okay, people told me to use my connections, or wrote to the brother of the president of the jury to support the case. you have some minister getting involved in some cases and so on and so forth. So the supporters and all this network was an important part of the ruling of the jury. And this jury was composed of 3 members, René Cassin, André Castelvinet, and Maxime Babasca. Shortly put, they were all related to the legal milieu and somehow all studied law in Paris before getting in the jury. And it's also representative of the composition of French politics before World War II. So basically lawyers are everywhere. So an example is that out of 19 French premiers, 13 were lawyers. In the purges, all members are connected to Parisian law universities. And after that, we still have this persistence. And we know that because of special clubs, bar associations, speech contests, and so on and so forth, this is quite a cohesive group as well. And so to dig a bit or to assess the impact of these connections between law graduates and the lawyers in the jury, we leverage data on individual characteristics of all MPs from previous works. And we have the court decisions to purge. And so we have 2 decisions per defendants, and we end up with around 800 observations. And so just to give you an intuition about the identification of the paper, basically in a lot of cases, the local courts, CDLs, Comité départemental de libération, and the jury, the national court, agreed on non-acquitting the defendants. And we will rely on these cases where they actually disagreed. So it's somehow a counterfactual analysis using the lower level of courts and comparing this decision with the upper level of courts. And so as I told you before, so each decision might be explained by court characteristics, and then you can capture that with a court fixed effect. Defendant characteristics, and so you can capture that with a defendant fixed effect, and our specific court treats individual characteristics, and that's the interaction component I told you about before. And so after controlling for 1 and 2, we can capture this third component, and that's the advantage group as before one specific court. To do so, we have a difference in differences estimates, where we add this court fixed effect, the defendant or group fixed effect. And we'll try to capture this beta-1 coefficient, capturing how specifically the jury treated some groups, and we'll focus on law graduates, so this LG. So basically, that's our results in a graph. So on the left panel, you have decisions by the local courts. And what you see is that you don't really have differences in acquittal rates between law graduates and other defendants. But when you turn to the national courts, then law graduates are more likely to be acquitted than other defendants. And so you have a difference in the acquittal rates between the 2 levels of court. So we also complete our estimation by controlling for some of the elements we have on the files, and by interacting these elements with the jury fixed effect, to be sure that we are not capturing some other effect of some confounding factors. In particular, we're controlling for proof of participation in resistance we found in the individual files of each defendant, and our estimates are pretty stable. And every time you see that the difference in acquittal rates between law graduates and others is around 10 percentage points higher in front of the jury. It doesn't depend on other individual characteristics or on information on resistant activities. And we somehow connect these results with persistence, because we first observed that the advantage of law graduates actually appeared when they ran for the first post-war elections. And when you're looking at the persistence of law graduates afterwards within our sample, so law graduates didn't have higher probability to be mayors after post-World War II, but they are more likely to have a career at the national stage after the purges, and it's quite driven by the estimator I've shown you before. So we also have a counterfactual analysis using proofs of participation in the resistance to predict acquittal rates. And we're quite happy because we're able to predict acquittal rates for non-law graduates, so for other defendants, showing that actually the jury really ruled based on this evidence of participation in resistance. And then for law graduates, we see that we have an unexplained part, which is about 10% as well. I will skip through the robustness checks to talk to you about the mechanisms now. So basically, I've just shown you that we have this difference in acquittal rates between the two levels of courts. And now we'll try to inform you about this connection story I had in introduction. So to do so, we went to the archives and we first test if we observe some differences in dossier content between law graduates and other defendants. So are the dossiers similar or different? And then we'll see if these differences somehow explained differences in acquittal rates or what we observed in the first part. And so we'll test if some dossier content actually correlates with higher acquittal, only for law graduates or for other defendants as well, and so on and so forth. And so we went to the archives of the jury donor, still classified, so you have to ask for authorization, and we somehow constructed an inventory of 17,500 documents. So we can track the investigation of the jury donor. We have these administrative reports, intelligence services reports, archives from the Vichy regime, but also letters of support from people actually sending letters to actually plead in favor of the defendant. Yeah, I'm running out of time, so I will just run through the rest of the results. So basically, the only component we found to be different between law graduates' files and others is proof of what we call indirect connections. So the power of supporters in a sense. And to put it very shortly, basically, law graduates are more likely to have supporters that also act as informants in other cases. So basically, their supporters are in connections with the jury for other cases and are trusted by the jury in other cases. And so they are stronger and may support the defendant better. And in the second set of estimates, we also see that these supporters and the strength of these supporters explain the higher acquittal rate of law graduates in front of the jury compared to the lower court. We find a specific effect of letters of support coming from Paris for law graduates. So it suggests that we have this Parisian law milieu that is actually supporting some defendant and explain higher acquittal. And we have importance of indirect connections in front of the jury for all defendants. So it's not only about law graduates, but other defendants benefiting from these connections are actually more likely acquitted afterwards. Those are not different on other dimensions. We have some strategies to tackle differences in legal skills. Maybe we can talk about it in the Q&A. And we find some evidence of direct differences in direct connections. So law graduate defendants are more likely to contact the jury themselves or to send documents to the jury, but actually these differences do not explain higher acquittal rates afterwards. So just to conclude, even in new democracies, political selection might be biased and might explain why some elites persist over different political regimes. We find that law graduates had a higher probability of being acquitted in the system we study in France, in post-World War II France. And this advantage is partly explained by indirect connection. So the intervention of connected supporters or connected to the jury supporters. And I thank you for your attention and pretty much look forward to Mark's comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fascinating paper. So yes, this paper brought me memories of a trip I did to the town of Vichy in France. And if you visit this town and you go to the opera hall, you will see such commemorative plaque. Well, since this session is recorded, I won't read it in French. I don't want to show the world my bad French accent. But it basically commemorates the vote that in 1940 gave full powers to Marshal Pétain, which eventually led to the establishment of the Vichy regime, a dictatorship that collaborated with Nazi Germany in World War II. And basically what the plaque says, it highlights the 80 members of parliament that voted against giving full powers to Marshal Pétain. So when I saw this, so it was very nice, but in my head I was thinking, what about the others? What about the remaining 589 parliamentarians that didn't oppose Marshal Pétain? And this fascinating paper looks at what happened to them, looks at their future political careers after democracy was restored in France, and uses this to shed new light on elite persistence and on how these elites can survive through transitions to democracy from authoritarian regimes. Okay, so as Jan explained, the process basically consisted on everybody that didn't vote against the act was banned from politics. Okay, but this ban could be waived by a two-stage process. So first, local court, so court at the department level made the decision, and then this could be appealed in a central court, the jury, formed by these 3 members, centralized in Paris and so on. And the authors of this paper focus on this very important elite in French politics, which is lawyers, and basically evaluate whether this elite had higher acquittal rates, if it was easier for them to continue in politics. Okay, so more generally, this tells us whether elites can persist these democratic purges, and in particular, this paper focuses on one mechanism through which elites can persist, which is this buildup of connections. Okay, so basically they use this particular structure of the process in a different setting, where the decisions at the local level are used as a control group for the decisions of the central jury. Okay, this is a strategy that has been used before to evaluate racial bias in court decisions, and they collect this amazing data set. I'll have some comments on it, but it's really fascinating. And then they have these 3 sets of results. First, that the lawyers did have an advantage. Okay, in particular, this differential acquittal amounts to 10 percentage points. So that's quite a large advantage. They also show that this lawyers elite had more direct and indirect connections to the jury. And then they show that the advantage of lawyers is basically explained by indirect connections, in particular those that are Paris-based. Okay, so first I have a couple of comments about the model. Just to be on the same page, this is a cheap talk model. Okay, they model the decisions of courts, which what's important here is that these courts are trying to avoid type 1 and type 2 errors. So they don't want to convict innocents, and they want to, avoid the mistake of not convicting guilty people. So that's really important because this is a democratic purge. So both elements are present here. And then the defendants, they present objective evidence, and then they present these non-verifiable mitigating circumstances. This is like the cheap talk part of it, okay? And they rule out informative equilibrium. So the only way these mitigating circumstances can be conveyed is through connections, okay? The direct connections are modeled with the cost of conveying this information that is lower for connected individuals. And the indirect connections is like a third party, which is partly aligned with the defendant and partly aligned with the court, and then can credibly send this signal. Okay, and they find the conditions under which these connections can help. So I think this is a very nice conceptual framework. It's very nicely tailored to guide the analysis. I just have 2 comments on it. First, I struggle a little bit with the welfare implications, because I mean, at the beginning of the motivation, you were saying that, you know, this elite persistence, we don't like it, it can be harmful and so on. But in this conceptual framework, basically, the connections help convey this private information about who participated in the resistance, right? So in the model, more connected individuals, whereas they're in the elite or not, it's better. It increases the welfare, because it allows to, you know, that the elite that survives, or the ones that survives, are the good ones, the ones that participated in the resistance. So I would suggest here to relate a little bit this to the group bias, this pi-j parameter that you have, that maybe this can lead to predictions more aligned to what we think about elite persistence in terms of welfare. And then there's this bit about that you emphasized in the motivation of democratic and non-democratic purges. And I think the model has this very nice feature that the courts also care about these type 1 errors. But somehow when I read it, I was expecting a bit more, like more relation with the connections, right? So does this increase the importance of connections, or does this decrease it? And I think this would be very helpful, even if it's just theoretically, to know, you know, a democratic or a non-democratic purge where connections would matter more there. Data, it's amazing. I think this is very nice. The only thing I would ask is to maybe even emphasize it more. So I missed a little bit more descriptives. So for example, on the local decisions, I would really like to see a map of the acquittal rates by department. And somehow, if you could show that this geographical distribution of acquittal rates is correlated somehow with resistance activity. So I know, for example, that some of the, you know, supply of arms is well documented. Just, you know, visually to see the map, because then that would tell me whether these local courts were biased or not with respect to the central ones, and where does the effect come from somehow. And in terms of the dossier data set, I also think that there's room for more analysis based on text analysis, but this I'll comment on my last comment, which is about the results. So as I said, the first result, I think it's very convincing that lawyers had an advantage. Direct connections, they don't seem to matter so much, and this makes sense. You explain it very well. Why not in the conceptual framework? Indirect connections matter, but only, like they explain the lawyer's advantage, only these like Paris-based connections, which I think it's nice, but does the fact that these guys studied in Paris only reflect connections, or, you know, do they reflect that they're better lawyers because they studied in Paris universities which were better, or were they more powerful politically, or was there more resistance activity in Paris? Some of these things need to be ruled out. And then lastly, I think the idea about the informality of the letters of support is very nice, but somehow the results look quite noisy. And I think that maybe this is because of the way this is measured, that you use this heading of the letters. If they say, "Dear Mr. Na," this suggests there's an informal relation. Maybe, I don't know. I suggest you 2 alternatives. One is, I don't know if they use the informal you versus the formal you. That could be another signal. But I think the data has so much potential that it would be worth like going the extra mile and trying some text analysis, you know, using groups of words to try to see the degree of informality of the letter, or, you know, how positive they were. And this maybe would give a more precise measure of these connections. But I think overall it's super interesting. very nice project, very important implications. And the last thing I want to say, also because it relates to the previous paper and the previous discussion, a point that Leah made about, this debate on centralized provision of public goods versus local provision of public goods. Here you can make the same argument, but with like purges, like should they be centralized? Should they be local? Here you can see a clear difference. I think it's very interesting to see that elite capture is stronger at the centralized level, because we tend to think of elites as being very powerful locally. So I think that's something maybe you want to push a little bit more, because it's a very nice result. I'm really looking forward to the questions on this and the previous paper too, and on the following paper that I shouldn't take more time. So Nicolas Zivart is going to present now on the National War, Labor Board, and Income Inequality. So Nicolas, the floor is yours.
Actually, Chris is going to present. I'm just here though.
Sorry. So Chris, the floor is yours.
Okay, everyone can see that? Good. Okay, so I should say at the beginning, this Census Bureau Disclosure Review Board has reviewed this disclosure, but all the views expressed are those of the authors alone and not of the Census Bureau. Okay, so this is a paper about the National War Labor Board in World War II and the effects that it had on labor income inequality. So this is a chart, not from us, of the Great Compression, which is relatively well known at this point, right? Which is that there was a dramatic fall in essentially any measure of inequality between 1940 and 1950. And these measures of inequality stayed at somewhat low levels for decades subsequent to that. And so to us, that suggests sort of two things. One is that maybe the war itself had a major effect on inequality. And two, what the war did to inequality might have been long lasting. Okay. So there have been a tremendous number of explanations proposed for what caused the Great Compression. And broadly speaking, you can think of them in two categories, some of them based on supply and demand, and some of them based on institutions. And these are, of course, not mutually exclusive. So some of the institutions that people have looked at are unions, changes in marginal tax rates, and the minimum wage. And people have also pointed to the National War Labor Board, which imposed a system of wage controls during World War II. But what hasn't really been done up to this point is any systematic micro-level evidence about what effects the wage controls of the National War Labor Board might have had. And so the goal of this paper is to introduce that evidence as to the effects of the wage controls imposed during World War II on income inequality in later decades. And so what we do is use the individual level data from the decennial censuses from 1940 as the prior period, and then for 1960 through 2000. And what we do is collapse this into occupation county cells and look at inequality within these occupation county cells. So this is a very kind of fine-grained measure of inequality. Thinking about, say, electricians in a particular county, what does the distribution of income look like among them? And our empirical strategy is to leverage variation, both by geography and by occupation in these controls, which are called brackets. And I'll be a little bit more precise in just a second about how exactly the NWLB operationalized these controls. But you can think of them as applying to very specific levels of occupation and geography during the war. And what we find is that the NWLB had a persistent effect on labor earnings. And this effect was concentrated in the lower percentiles. In particular, if we look at measures of the 50-10 gap in wages in a particular occupation, in a particular county, higher levels of this so-called bracket are associated with higher levels of inequality in subsequent decades. So just very briefly, the historical background of the National Rural Labor Board. It was established very quickly after Pearl Harbor, and it did a number of dramatic things, two of which I'll highlight here, because they sort of illustrate what exactly the NWLB was trying to do. One of the things it did was impose a particular level of a cost of living adjustment in July of 1942. So this is what was called the Little Steel formula. And what it did was it said that the NWLB would subsequently allow any increase of up to 15% as a cost of living adjustment. Okay, and so it was trying to stop inflation, or at least tamp down inflation by this. But this was not a general wage freeze of a 15% increase. The NWLB still was authorized to and still did allow other adjustments for other reasons of wages. This was thought to be getting out of hand, and so in April of 1943, the Roosevelt administration issued an executive order called the Hold the Line Order, which implemented this bracket policy. So it had two goals. One of them, or at least two primary goals. One of them was to prevent inflation. This is the one most people think of as the goal of a system of price or wage controls. And that certainly was one of their goals, but it was not their only goal. They were also concerned with controlling the movement of manpower into war production. In particular, they were very worried about the fact that they believed there was excessive amounts of labor mobility, that people were chasing these higher wages, and that this was hampering the war effort. And so they wanted to stop this, but they also wanted to channel people into areas of the economy that they felt would benefit the war. Right? So it was not a general wage freeze. It was a deliberate system of trying to impose changes on the wage structure to further the war effort. So what did they do? They established these so-called brackets. So what a bracket was not a maximum wage. What a bracket was a particular level in the wage distribution above which no further increases would be permitted. Okay, so if your wage was above the bracket, it could not be increased after that. Wages below the bracket would be allowed to be increased. Okay, so that's the idea here. Anything that was below the bracket could be increased up to the level of the bracket. Anything above the bracket was frozen in place. So these brackets were set very finely. So they were set at the level of particular occupations. They were sometimes varied across industries, and they were set at very fine levels of geographic precision. This varied across the country. So some parts of the country set the brackets at the level of individual towns, assigning them to metropolitan areas. Some parts of the country assigned them to counties. Some parts of the country assigned them to just general regions. So there's a lot of heterogeneity in how these controls were assigned. Okay? They were set by one of two methods, at least in theory. Okay, so in order to do this project, the National Labor Board undertook a very large-scale survey of the economy in 1943, and then got the distribution of wages, and either set the bracket, again, at least in theory, by what's called the clustering method, or finding the first substantial cluster of wages, or by setting the bracket at 10% less than the mean of the underlying distribution. Okay? In theory, the coverage of the National Labor Board was vast. In theory, it covered all private wage adjustments. In practice, we're not going to be able to look at the majority of wage adjustments for reasons of data completeness that I'll clarify in a second. So the theoretical effects of this bracket policy are actually very subtle and somewhat complicated. So we have in our paper a very kind of stylized model, a two-period model, thinking about what happens when you impose this bracket on a measure of inequality. So here is just a graph from this. And we've drawn it in such a way that higher on this graph is associated with lower levels of inequality. And we're thinking about the marginal effect of changing the bracket, because that's what we're going to estimate in this paper. And so you can think about sort of the extreme cases, a very low bracket, right? freezes the wage distribution in place. Okay, so the marginal effect of an increase in the bracket is 0 because the entire wage distribution is set. Similarly, if you impose a very high bracket, right, it's non-binding. Okay, so then the marginal effect is also 0. But what happens in between is, at least in the example we have a non-monotone effect. So why do we have a non-monotone effect? Well, if you think about a bracket that's set, you know, somewhere between the 25th and you're increasing it to the 26th, 27th percentile, okay? You froze, and we're looking at the 25-75 ratio. You've frozen the 75th percentile in place, but now you're allowing an increase, right, in the 25th percentile that you weren't allowing before. Say you've moved the bracket from the 25th to the 30th percentile, right? Now those people have access to raises, okay? So the marginal effect of an increase in the bracket then is to lower inequality, okay? But eventually you get to a point, right, where you've increased the bracket enough that increases in subsequent increases in the bracket, right, are now allowing you to move the 75th percentile out, which was previously frozen in place, right? But it was not binding on the 25th percentile anyway, right? Because they're able to get the increase that they were going to get, right? And so at that point, a marginal effect of an increase in the bracket is to increase inequality. So the actual theoretical effects of changing the bracket are actually a difficult theoretical problem to pin down. So what are we going to do in this paper? So we're going to use the 1940 census as the both as the prior and the contemporaneous measure of the income distribution. We don't have access to the income distribution in 1943, and we're going to use the 1960 through 2000 population censuses to look at subsequent outcomes. So these are the decadal censuses. We restrict attention to males between 18 and 64 who are working at least part-time in either white-collar occupations or the metal trades. And the reason we restrict attention to these is these are consistently recorded in the National Labor Board records, okay? So there are a lot of data construction issues here, and we should be upfront about those, right? One is that it might strike you as unusual we're not looking at 1950, and the reason is that even in the research data centers, the 1950 census is a mess. It's only a 1% sample, and even that is not particularly well constructed, and so it's just not useful for us at the level of a particular county. The other or another major complication is actually matching these occupational controls to the census is very challenging. Some of that is because they use a different occupational coding scheme than the census. In particular, the census collapses a number of occupations into large categories such as operative, which are not particularly useful. Another complication is that the National Labor Board records, even though the authority of the NWLB was essentially total, they did not actually establish brackets for all occupations. It was considered enough to establish brackets for what they called key occupations. And this was enough to essentially peg the entirety of the wage structure, okay? For that reason, a lot of occupations are simply uncovered. And this is another reason that we have this, you know, occupation-specific approach to studying the effects of the National Labor Board. The third major complication is that they are not consistent in how they code sub-county geographies. So sometimes they establish brackets at towns, sometimes they establish at counties, sometimes they don't define what a particular region means. So they'll say this bracket applies to Detroit and leave it totally vague, at least in the records to which we have access, as to what Detroit means, if that's the metropolitan area, the city itself, et cetera. And so for that reason, even though the theoretical control of the National Labor Board was again, total, we're actually restricted to sort of particular counties and particular occupations that we can look at. So here we've plotted the bracket for one particular occupation, stenographers. Okay, at least the brackets to which we have access. And this illustrates a lot of what goes on in the National Labor Board records. So first of all, some of the records simply don't survive. So Washington, Oregon, we've looked, we just cannot find the National Rural Labor Board records for those. Other parts of the country don't actually specify what the brackets are applying to. So this is a problem, say, in Pennsylvania. But lots of the country we do have covered. And so you can see that different regions, which are denoted by these black lines, so the National Rural Labor Board brackets were set by individual regions. Different regions employed quite different approaches to setting these brackets. So you look at the regions covered by Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma. They set one bracket for stenographers for the entire region, right, with no variation whatsoever. The same is true of Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa. The South, Southeast, by contrast, divided every county into one of 4 different zones, okay, theoretically based on cost of living, and set a different bracket for each of these 4 zones. Okay? In the Northeast, they assigned brackets to particular towns, which we aggregate up to the level of a county. So what this means is that there's extensive geographic variation in the level of a particular bracket. Okay? So what we're going to do is define for our estimation purposes what we call the bindingness of the bracket. So what we do is take the bracket and we deflate it by some measure of the income distribution in 1940. So we have a number of different approaches to this. The ones I'll present today are deflated by the 10th percentile of the 1940 distribution. Again, we're taking that as a proxy for the 1943 distribution, to which we don't have access. We use variation in the bindingness of a bracket. So you can think about if the bracket relative to the 10th percentile is higher, right? What that means is you're allowing more of the income distribution in that occupation, in that county, to receive an increase in the wage. Okay, so that's the idea here, right? If you set a higher bracket, right, you're freezing in place less of the income distribution, right? And so we're measuring, again, the strength of the bracket, right, is measured relative to the underlying distribution in 1940. Okay. So what that generates is a lot of heterogeneity across counties, and this is what we're going to use to do our empirical analysis, right? And so what this means is that even though, flipping back a second, even though Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana assigned one bracket for stenographers for this particular, for everyone, right? In fact, that bracket relative to the underlying distribution is quite different. And so that generates a lot of heterogeneity that we're able to take advantage of in our estimation. Okay. So what we do is a long difference specification. So we use as our outcome measure a change in the inequality measure of a particular occupation and a particular county. And so we use that as the outcome measure. And what we're trying to study the effects of is the bindingness of the bracket, right? So if you have a higher bracket set relative to the 1940 distribution, do you see a difference in the change in inequality in that particular occupation county cell, right? That's the idea here. And we've set it up so that a positive coefficient is a reduction in inequality because we use the 1050 gap. So we love to be able to test for pre-trends. We can't. 1940 is the first year for which the census has information about income. So what we do instead is use the 1940 measures of the inequality statistic and its square, right? So we're looking at the change in the inequality statistic as the outcome measure and we use as controls, the main controls, the 1940 and its squares. So this is a sort of measurement error approach to estimation, right? We're thinking about the bracket was set, higher relative to where it should have been relative to the underlying distribution, at least in 1940. Okay, and what the effects of that are on changes in inequality. Okay, we do a number of different ways of specifying the fixed effects. Our preferred approach is occupation fixed effects. We also experiment with occupation county fixed effects. And in this regression, we weight it by the size of the cell, right? So how many people are in this particular county in this particular occupation. And so here we've plotted 3 statistics of changes in the inequality measure in the occupation county. So the 1050 measure, the 1090 measure, and the 5090 measure. Okay? And so we do it by decade out to 2000. And so here we're showing the results deflated by the 10th percentile. I'll show the deflated by the 25th percentile in just a second, right? But remember, a higher number here means a higher relative bracket, i.e., in theory, more of the population was eligible to receive an increase in their wage. And so what we see is by the 1050 and the 1090 measures of inequality, you see that a higher bracket is associated with higher levels of inequality in 1960. Okay, and even though the 1090 ratio shows this change, right, the 5090 shows very little effect, right? It's close to 0, the point estimate. It's a little bit hard to interpret these numbers precisely, but this is very little effect on the income distribution in 1960 as measured by the 5090 ratio, right? And so what this suggests is that the National Labor Board had, at least for a period of, this would be out 15 years from the war, right, had an effect on the income distribution measured in this way. Okay? If we instead deflate by the 25th percentile, we get pretty similar results, right? Which suggests that, how exactly we're measuring the bindingness of the brackets hopefully is not affecting our results too much. Okay, again, there's going to be some measurement error just implicit in the fact that we're using 1940, right? And at least in theory, the National Labor Board is using 1943 to set these things. But the best we can do is try just different measures of the bindingness, and hopefully the results are reasonably robust to that. Okay. If we vary the
Chris,
set,
I'm sorry to say, but you should wrap up your.
Sure. Okay, so I was supposed to get a chat. Okay, anyway. So just to conclude, right? If you see these kind of enduring effects, you would say like, well, what could be a possible mechanism of persistence? And we don't have any direct evidence, but we're going to at least point to unions, which in some survey evidence, unions actually said they took the brackets of the Natural Labor Board and said, this is great, we're going to take these going forward and peg our wage demands to this. And so we think this is a possible mechanism of persistence. And apologies if I went long. Thank you.
Thank you. No problem. So now we will move to Robert's discussion.
So thanks very much for having me discuss this paper. Much appreciated. For obvious reasons will be obvious. I'm very interested in this work. So a little bit of background. There are, let me just see if I can. There are substantial changes in U.S. labor inequality, we know, in the 20th century. And if we think of a secular pattern in the first half of the 20th century, there's declining inequality, and then there's rising inequality in the second half. So it's following an inverted U, and there's a vast amount of work that shows that these changes are a combination of between group inequality changing and then within group inequality changing. Where within group inequality, we're either talking about within an occupation or from a sort of a log wage regression, looking at wage residuals. There's one particular period that's received a lot of interest, and this is the Great Compression. I'd like to be able to tell you that I'm the one that invented this title. My co-author here, Claudia, is a master at coming up with really clever titles, and she was the one that actually came up with that title. It's a substantial narrowing of labor income between 1940 and 50. There are large changes before the war. It begins to unravel shortly afterwards, but at least Claudia and I thought it remained economically significant at least to 1970, and you could argue that it lasts even longer than that. So why does this occur? In our paper, we talk a lot about shifts in labor demand and supply during and after the war. We also talk about long-run narrowing of school quality differences in the first half of the 20th century. And then there's a lot in the paper about the effect of labor market institutions. None of it is really tested in our paper. This paper is now quite old. It's about 30 years old. But we mentioned unions, minimum wage, the National War Labor Board, and subsequently there's been work on a number of these things. And this paper is about one of these institutions, the National War Labor Board. Mostly when we were thinking about the effect of the National War Labor Board, if you go back and read our paper, you'll see that we were focused on the war period itself. We were interested in how the board affected wage inequality changing during the war. And I'll just mention briefly here that when we were writing this paper, Claudia, on several occasions, spoke directly with John Dunlop, the great Harvard labor economist, of course, who was the head statistician of the NAALB, and then afterwards was so important in terms of public policy as it had to do with wage determination. And so it's a good deal of how the paper was actually written, especially the discussion of the NAALB, came out of her sort of interviewing Dunlop. We were not particularly interested in the paper, and we didn't speculate, I think, at least we tried not to, on what the long-run effect of the NAALB would be, but I think we certainly imagined that there might be one, and it would I'd like to call it here a John Dunlop treatment effect. It has to do about the actual policies that were adopted during the war and how they might have affected the evolution of wage inequality afterwards. I'll just take a moment to just mention personally, when I was a graduate student at Harvard, my advisor was the late Robert Fogel, and every year he invited his graduate students to dinner at his house, and he would invite one of his famous friends to dinner. One time I met Simon Kuznets at one of these dinners, the only time I ever met Simon Kuznets, and another time I met John Dunlop. And Dunlop was still very active back when I was a student in the 1970s, and very recently, as in like 2 weeks ago, or about 2 weeks ago, actually less than that, my wife and I had dinner with one of his former students, my colleague at Boston University, Peter Doringer, he wrote Doringer and Peoria, and many important contributions to the understanding of internal labor markets after World War II. And so I asked Peter, what did he recall about Dunlop, and how did Dunlop think about his experience after, as running the NAALB, is how it affected wage determination. And Peter talked a bit about, it was mostly about unions, but it was also about sort of nitty gritty stuff about, when you're negotiating labor wage agreements, do you permit changes in absolute differentials like 10% an hour, everybody gets 10% more, or relative differentials, or 10 cents or 10% more. And so there is a reason to think, because of Dunlop's influence, that there would be a long run effect, although we didn't actually do anything about this. And so this is really an important question. So this paper is at an early stage, at least that's my reading of it. It's at a fairly early stage. They've been working on it very hard. I want to emphasize that this is a very important new project. And to emphasize it's very important, you can see I put very important in capital letters, okay? And they're too, I think it's going to be a while to where we really understand what's going on here, okay? But I want to emphasize these are really significant data contributions. So these, Chris and Nick are two of the very best scholars working right now in sort of like archival work, and this is a really impressive. I wouldn't have thought that you could do this, okay, that you could actually dig this stuff up, but they've dug up the actual NLLB records and done all this work in the Census Data Center. So that's very impressive. And there's a lot of useful stuff in this paper too about the institutional analysis. The preliminary results are surprising. If you asked me before this, I would have said no. I would have thought, if you asked me what I would have thought it was going to be, I would have thought it was the opposite result. Okay, and so that I think is really where the paper's at. It's trying to figure out why they're getting the coefficient they're getting. And you want to keep in mind that the NLLB goes out of existence, right? So it's not like it's running wage determination in the United States through 1970. It's out of business after the war. So this is somehow affecting wage norms and how people negotiated these things, right? So we still have a lot of thinking to do about what the actual where the effect is coming from. So the dependent variable here is the change in some measure of inequality between 1940 and up to 2000. And it's measured in such a way so that the treatment effect here is going to be negative. And there, as Chris explained, their key independent variable is going to be this wage bracket. And if the coefficient's positive, then the long-run effect of this policy is to reduce inequality in a very narrowly defined labor market in an occupation. One might have hoped ex ante that you would be able to cover a large number of occupations and most of the country, but as economic historians know, you get into the weeds and you discover it's really, really hard. And so we have a narrower analysis here, but still, I want to emphasize just how impressive the data analysis here. And then there are going to be lots of other variables on the right-hand side. The coefficient's generally negative, so it's the opposite sign that we're expecting, and this lasts till 1960, which is pretty long. Otherwise, it's basically a small and statistically insignificant, and the results seem pretty robust to the sort of standard types of robustness checks that one might try to do here. So. The explanation that was given in the presentation has to do with the setting of a soft maximum, which would allow some establishments to raise the wage if they wanted, but they didn't have to, right? So, I do want to just sort of emphasize that we're all economists here, and at least we're all trained and think in terms of competitive markets. I don't think John Dunlop thought in terms of competitive markets, and my colleague Peter Doringer really thinks about internal labor markets. So they had a really complicated model of a local labor market in mind. You can just see that in the way in which they set these wage maximums. They didn't try to micromanage the wage structure that much. They just pegged a few occupations, and so. Just thinking about what exactly is the right model that these guys, what's the model these guys had in mind back then when they were doing this, is just a hard question in and of itself. And it's not something that, at least as I was reading this paper, I was trying to think about what the model was, and I just had a hard time, because I think it's just not my normal way of thinking about wage determination. Anyway, I think I'll skip this in the interest of time. And I just want to sort of, the last bullet point here, which is really, I think, the point I want to make is that because we don't really have a great model of how these establishments are responding at the time or afterwards, it's conceivable that you could get the result that you get in their paper. Maybe it's for the reasons that they give in their model, that it has to do with the institution imprinting on people's minds afterwards in terms of how wage determination happens, 20 years after the place. But it still is a very complicated it's a result, and it's sort of in search, I think, of a model here. A couple minor suggestions. I was a little unclear in the paper about the sample selection. The selection here is the adult males who worked part-time in the preceding year. I wanted a little more clarity in the paper on what exactly was meant by part-time. The next bullet point here is maybe my most important one. I often get hired, to be a discussant on papers that use the 1940 census, right? And so I just want to make a point here that not everybody is aware of. I think the authors are, but I'm not sure everybody else is. That when you observe wages in 1940, the wages that you observe pertain to 1939. But, the occupation and the industry that the person is the occupation and industry that they're in March of 1940 in the census week. Now, there will be people in these data who in 1939 were working in work relief occupations and work relief jobs, okay? And their wages in 1939 will reflect the wages that they got in those jobs. But you won't know that, okay? Because in 1940, their occupation might be stenographer, okay? Right? And I think, in some context, I commented on a paper in another session a few days ago where I don't think it probably matters. It's a little bit hard for me to tell here because we have a large part of the country, there's a lot of variation in the work relief program that they're looking at. And, basically those programs could have also had long-run effects. So I think the authors need to, there's a little bit of thinking about how the work relief program might intersect here. The focus here is on males. In my paper with Claudia, where we were talking about the effect of the NLLB, where we thought that during the war, the NLLB actually did compress things. And again, I want to emphasize, this paper is not about the war. It's about what happens after the war. I'm wondering whether it would be worthwhile maybe extending this and looking at women as well, because it was in the industries in which women were very prominent. We actually didn't see the type of effect that they're seeing. So I think that might be worthwhile. I'm going to skip the next bullet point. That shouldn't have been there. I realized afterwards the authors did this. I'm going to suggest, if they have the time and the money and it doesn't create too much difficulty with COVID, that they might want to take a trip to the JFK Library in Boston, where John Dunlop's papers are. Some of them are there, and I think some of them are at the National Archives. And there might be some interesting things in those papers that could be useful in terms of thinking about why there is this long-run effect. And again, from my conversations with my colleague Peter Doringer, I'm feeling that there would be, okay, that Dunlop, the way Dunlop trained people and taught people about labor markets was very much influenced by his experience on the NLLB. So there may very well be useful things there. So thanks very much. Again, a really fantastic project, and I look forward to the published version of this paper.
Thank you very much to everyone. So already, so now we open the floor for questions. Just let me say the attendance of this session also there's a sufficiently small number of them such that if you want to ask questions, just raise your hand and you'll be allowed to speak in Zoom and everybody can hear the question.
Mark, are you sure that that's possible? Isn't this a webinar?
Yes, but I have the power to allow people to talk,
Great.
which is feels interesting. Anyway, so Leah has a question already, so you can start.
I actually have two comments. First for Jean. You sort of started your presentation with this idea that that elite persistence is per se bad. I don't think you need that. I feel like you don't need that for the results to be interesting or to be motivated. And I think you might actually be better. First, this seems to me like a contentious point, and when you don't have to, you don't have to take that stand for your paper to be interesting. You might say, look, there's a debate about the importance of elite persistence. You could talk about Hannah Arendt's analysis of the French Revolution versus the American Revolution. You could talk about, the deliberate American decision to keep Nazis in Germany versus the what many regard as a failure in later Iraq when we got rid of all the, prior elite. I think people, I don't know, like my view is that people view that as a bad policy choice in retrospect. So I feel like it might make your paper more interesting to say, like, it's not clear whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. There are arguments on either side. And for Chris, I was wondering, so you motivated your paper against this, the picture from Bob, Margot, and Claudia Golden that shows this great compression in inequality at the national level. I'm not convinced that's true if you look at local inequality. Like if you took the average of local inequality measures, do you see a compression as well? Because they needn't average to the national measures. I thought a bit about this because I tried to write a paper about this at some point. So it's not clear that your measure, like Bob sort of posed it as a puzzle, like we see this great compression, but your results don't explain this compression. But it's not clear to me that at the local level, there is a compression to explain.
Yeah, so I would say the reason we focus on this like hyper specific measure of inequality, a lot of it just has to do with data limitations and trying to be as precise with identification as possible. How exactly you aggregate up, the effects of the National Labor Board, given the data we have, into something, some big claim about, the Great Compression itself. I mean, that's something that we've, I'd say struggle with, and it probably would be maybe a better paper. I don't know. I mean, hopefully it would have like the 1940 and the 1950 data, which maybe in April will be, something we can actually do. And yeah, I mean, I think we'd have to make some compromises on identification and say, we're going to look at, we're going to aggregate, aggregate up the blue collar occupations, the white collar occupations, or something like that. Aggregate up the brackets of those, cook up some way of saying, okay, can you use the difference in those brackets to say what should happen to the, skill premium or something like that, right?
I was just actually suggesting something more simple. If you look at the distribution of changes across counties in inequality, within county changes in inequality, if you look at that distribution across counties, what does the average of that distribution look like? The within county change in inequality.
That's a good question.
I'm pretty confident there is no measure of that. Making that measure would be a contribution, and it would give you a benchmark against which to think about your coefficient. And that across county measure the average across counties of the within county measure need not equal the national measure. That's all I really want to say.
Yes, so Jean, you can take it from here.
Yeah, just to say thanks to Leah, some stuff to think about, and will do. And also have a question for Chris. Would it be possible to look at the whole distribution of wages and not only these inequality measures? Because if at some point you have a bracket, then maybe you have some bunching in the distribution at some stages, and then your inequality measure do not really catch that or could miss that. It might be infeasible, but it might be also for visualization, it might be great, I think.
Yeah, I mean, so we've thought about doing different kind of, very specific, percentile by percentile measures. Yeah, I mean, we should probably do that. I mean, we're a little bit constrained in there are limits on what we're allowed to disclose out of the RDC, and when you start trying to disclose, a tremendous number of percentiles across a tremendous number of occupations, then the disclosure people are going to frown on that. And so, one of the reasons for this more sort of constrained approach, I guess, was trying to. I mean, there's a lot more that I didn't have time to sort of get to. We're already disclosing, X number of figures, and they might frown on disclosing more, or if we just start doing it over and over and over. But yeah, I mean, we should probably think about trying to sort of characterize the distribution more than just by those particular metrics.
So I'll take it from here. I have a question for Jonathan, thinking also more about, since the paper is already published, about the future research, and also about this question on centralized versus local provision, and your comment on, or the general question, could Britain have done better in this? And I was wondering about the political economy side of the story, and interest groups in these policies, because I mean, if you take let's say if you take the Galore unified growth theory framework here, you have this group of landowners that what are basically trying to prevent is the rural labor force fleeing from the countryside to the cities, and the better sanitation in these urban areas, the more attractive they become. So there might be potential for economic incentives here for opposing these policies from certain groups, in which case it would also be something calling for some central provision, perhaps, if this elites of local power. But perhaps you can say, yeah, if you have looked something on the interest groups part of the story.
So, I mean, to some extent, yes, I guess. I think the debate normally in the center is about, I mean, so the reason this is decentralized in the first place, right, is a lot about interest groups. The people want to say that, well, if you want it, you should pay for it yourselves. And I think eventually there is this, so I think the story here is less about interest groups, it's more just about what the Treasury is doing. And I actually read a blog post earlier with someone suggesting there's this Treasury culture over the last 200 years, which is possibly true, that actually at this point, a lot of people have accepted that sanitation is a good thing. If you want to pay for it, it's fine. Access to credit is important. But the Treasury just start panicking when debt is going up very quickly. And actually, when you go 30 years down the line, it doesn't look very high at all. But by the standards of the time, it was very, very high. And so I think it is quite interesting. And I don't even know if a historian has looked at it properly, the actual history of that culture and their sort of real reluctance to destabilize or potentially destabilize, the British government's borrowing ability. And I don't know, maybe that's driven by some interest group initially, but it seems at some point to be kind of ingrained. Because this thing I was reading was saying, even after the Second World War, you had exactly the same situation when people were like, well, we could invest in these new technologies, and the Treasury was like, no, we shouldn't borrow to do this. And so there's like this long run history of this, I think, is what's driving this particular sort of failing in the loans board. Because I think one thing that's really interesting is that in the 1890s, the Treasury start panicking the other way and suddenly start really wanting to actually make sure someone takes these loans because they've almost put themselves out of a job in some sense. It's very obvious they failed when people want to start repaying the loans. So I have a question as well, if there's been. Oh. Yeah, so for Jean, I was wondering, I was trying to get my head around and I haven't worked it out yet, so I guess you've thought about it. So how, when we think about these courts, they're really interesting. I was just trying to translate like this very formal structure. If I think about transitions in general, do you think this is kind of like, it's the same set of circumstances, just less formal in general? Do you have a kind of informal trials going on? Or not, I guess. And then I also had a question for Chris and Nicholas. So I was wondering, is there a possible set of mechanisms here which go through who's working within a household? That in some places, if like the wage the wage you can earn as like the head of household is constrained, that could change household employment patterns. And then that translates into whatever. And I guess that might be something you could look at, is why I was wondering as well. That might be something you can observe in the census. Although I know nothing about the US Census data, so maybe not. But that was what I had in mind. So, thanks.
Thanks for the question. So basically, we have information about the trials in the jury, and it was super formalized. So basically, you have to send a memoir to support your case and some documents, and basically the defendant has to send this, and you can have hearing to the court as well. For local courts, it's a lot more messy. Basically, so these are courts, but formed of resistance. And
sorry, I think maybe I wasn't clear. I understood these are very formal. What I meant is, if I thought about a totally different transition and say Venezuela or something, should what mechanism translates to there, even if it's not very formal on these things, it's still there's like a kangaroo court or something, and then some kind of informal jury. Would you think exactly the same story translates or not?
So I mean, for the Venezuelan case, I think it would be, it might be more messy in that case. So basically what we need for our setting to apply is this optimization of the acquittal rate of innocence and optimization of sentencing guilty people, and then some intervention possible for defendants. And that was the case in Poland. We know that a bit in Chile as well. So we have this historical accounts for these countries. And maybe I should read some stuff about the Iraq case. I didn't do it before, but I guess I got a cue there tonight. So, but you're right. We should think of other cases where we have these three elements we've mentioned. So yeah, should keep digging.
Yeah, I guess to answer your question, yeah, I mean, we've thought about all sorts of other possible outcome measures, participation, or I mean, you could look at it sort of within household changes as well. Again, hopefully 1950 census will be available soon. I would say it brings back to the sort of overarching point several people have made, which is that like in no way are we claiming that the NWLB, existence of it probably lowered inequality, right? We're not sort of disputing that just because we have a sort of different aspect of the long run effects we're looking at, right? And so to answer that kind of question, the kind of question that like, wow, the NWLB increased blue collar earnings in this area relative to this other area because of how it imposed the controls, and that had some effect on, women's labor force participation or education attainment or whatever, right? I mean, that would require sort of a quite different way of thinking about aggregating up the brackets into sort of a bigger treatment effect, which is something we definitely is on our agenda. For right now, we're just trying to, in this sort of very narrowly defined and we hope reasonably well identified framework trying to establish, that this thing did have lasting consequences. Yeah.
I'll then ask another question to Jean that I didn't have time to mention in the discussion. So it's also about the, I mean, one particularity of the setting, which is the fact that the Vichy regime is quite short-lived, so that the connections that these defendants were leveraging on are connections formed in the previous regime, which it still talks about elite persistence, and but maybe it also was it's related to Leah's question before, or comment about taking a stance on whether elite persistence is good or bad. Here we're not talking so much about the elite formed during the Vichy regime persisting. It's the previous elite surviving through the Vichy regime as well as they can, and then keeping in power. So that's perhaps also something important to take into account.
Yeah, sure. And basically all the connections we're talking about were mostly from before Vichy. And so maybe we should be clearer that actually Vichy didn't disturb these connections, and these connections were still active afterwards. And then, yeah, I got your point, and maybe we should adapt a bit the framing to that as well. Thanks.
So we still have time for more questions in case anyone has something in mind, also amongst attendees.
I guess, can I ask a question about John? I guess I was wondering about, with your setup, you sort of were, I think, trying to conceptualize these courts as being, I guess you call them truth finders, whether people are guilty or innocent. I was wondering if that's really the case, or whether it was more, what is it, whether the people are guilty or innocent, or is it more about what is the right punishment? I mean, like, it seems like the people that went there, unless I'm misunderstanding, were guilty in some sense. But the question is, like, what is the right punishment given their actions? So I guess I wonder to what extent it makes sense to sort of conceptualize it as a type 1 versus type 2 error, as, again, more about a punishment. Like, what's, what do you mean getting right or wrong? It seems sort of different in this case. So that's just how I always thought about it. And I was just wondering too, if there's other, was there only one punishment, whether either you got forever banned or nothing, or was there sort of a continuum of punishments that they could mete out?
Yeah, thanks. So basically punishment was binary. So either your ban is waived or not. And then at the end of the 50s, actually they waived the ban for everybody, because most of them are not there anymore. Regarding your first point, actually quite interesting. So I'm not sure that we only define them as like binary deciders, like truth or not truth, because in our setting we have this alpha, which is how much weight I put to type 1 versus type 2 errors. And maybe they're trying to find a balance there. And with some set of evidence, this alpha will measure how much I think that this guy should be banned or not. And so maybe a good framing would be yours, actually. I'm not sure it will change the model, but it will change the denominator, like how we define alpha in that case. So the weight the court will give to type 1 versus type 2. And if the court really thinks, okay, it's totally unfair to ban a politician for a vote 4 years ago, then this alpha will be super high and putting a lot of weight to not sentence an innocent. So that would be for the first one. And second, so you said that they were all guilty. So as Mark said, actually, only 80 MPs opposed the Untitled Act to Pétain. So basically, not opposing did not really mean active participation with the Vichy regime. So this really is good for us because we can define the set of defendants. But I would not be like really accusing these persons actually not opposing the Untitled Act as really active in the Vichy regime. So that maybe that was not clear from the beginning.
Yeah, I guess kind of follow up. I guess the question would be like, how many of the letters that get sent in are more factual, like he didn't do it or he did this versus like he did it, but he's like a super nice guy, he's fun to hang out with. You should be kind to him. But it seems like that'd be kind of interesting, right? Like if there's a way, I don't know. I mean, it's sort of fuzzy, right? Like exactly how you would classify that, but somehow if you could sort of classify it into kind of the first stage of guilt or not, and then 2, like what is the right punishment, I think, and like whether, they're trying to just sort of leniency, I think that would be kind of potentially sort of interesting.
Yeah, so what we do when classifying these letters of support, we can determine if they are claiming participation in the resistance or just like this guy actually needs political opinions or orientation to be lenient. So we didn't really dig into that so far because it's super granular and I don't know how much variation we have there. But basically, everybody knows that it's about participation in the resistance. So every time the supporter sent a letter, somehow he relates his letter to participation in the resistance. And some of them, like minority, will evoke the political orientation thing, but it's like a small share of the documents you observe.
Great. So I have this warning that the session will be over in 3 minutes. So perhaps we have time for one last short question. Otherwise, we can conclude this.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. I will stop recording now.
Bye.
Bye.